I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Jakob Mokander. Jakob is a final year PhD student at the Oxford Internet Institute and is advised by Luciano Floridi. He's a visiting fellow at CITP this year. He holds a master's degree in engineering from Linköping University in Sweden and in social science from Oxford. Before beginning his PhD, Jakob worked in the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs and amongst other locations, was also posted in New Delhi in India. His current research focuses on developing and evaluating methods to audit AI systems from an AI governance perspective. His talk today concerns auditing large language models. Specifically, he's going to talk about a three-layered approach for auditing LLMs, including governance audits, model audits, and application audits. Without further delay, over to Jakob.
Thank you, Varun. And also, I want to start by thanking all of you who come here today, and also to CITP for having me, not only for the talk today, but as a fellow this year. I could not have thought of a better place to write up my PhD thesis in. And I have over many Tuesdays benefited from being on the other side of these kinds of talks. Today, I have used a bit of a clickbaity title, including large language models. But if we look at the actual agenda, I will first talk a bit about auditing of AI in general. So I'll spend the first half of talking about my larger research agenda and project, and then zoom in on our most recent publication, which is focusing on auditing large language models more specifically. And the reason why I have designed the talk in this way is because I think with the latest, shall we call it, attention given to large language models, you're all in this room and also online, hello everyone, probably quite familiar with recent developments in large language models and the ethical and social challenges these models pose. So I thought it was better to take a step back and to see what is auditing in this regard and what can we expect from auditing as a governance mechanism applied to large language models. So that's the agenda for the day. I'll also try to leave ample of time and space for discussion in the end. So if we look at very briefly at the background, and I will go through the first few slides super briefly, that it's not only cognitive tasks, but we can see more broadly that the number of tasks that used to be performed by humans are increasingly being automated. And this, of course, holds some benefits, both in terms of consistency and efficiency, but it also poses a number of social and ethical challenges, as you're all aware of. And the two things I want to highlight here is that it's not unique to large language models that they enable a wide range of downstream applications, such as medical diagnostics, recruitment, issuing of loans and credit cards. This goes through automation of tasks quite generally. The second is, it's also very seldom a question of specific technologies, but all these different computational techniques are tied together by a number of macro trends, which is driving this development, such as the growing availability of data. We have advances in research and development connected to machine learning, but also economic and social pressures. There are also forces out there that pushes us in this direction. When it comes to the ethical and social implication, I think especially in this room and at CITP, we're all aware of the more specific ethical challenges like privacy invasions, for example, or erroneous or discriminatory outcomes. But if we zoom out and look at how these technologies impact society more broadly, there are also a host of other risks, such as, for example, removing human responsibility or devaluing human skills that are one step removed in terms of level of abstractions from many more fine granular ethical and social challenges. So what I want to say here is that other governance mechanisms, not just auditing, but where they come into play here is not so much as evaluating technologies on a case-by-case basis, whether to say if it's good or bad, but more to balance here these improvements in, for example, consistency and efficiency that are driving this development with constraints of how to govern these technologies. And this brings us to the governance challenges. What exactly do automated decision-making systems generally, but also, as we will see, large language models change in how decisions were made before? One of the first is the autonomy of these systems. So autonomous systems can have unintended impact. So instead of a linear, we have a non-linear is from design to impact. Another is the ability to learn. So previously, we used to verify systems based on their capabilities and then implement them. But a system evolves over time that undermines both verification procedures, but also makes it harder to assign responsibility and accountability when harm occurs. And perhaps the one that I find most interesting is the final one. It says that AI system curtails the space for ethical deliberation in the decision-making process, and it also pushes it upstream. So to take a very, sorry, this is not a very nice example, but take a knife. Different types of knives in their design can have different affordances. For example, either to cut vegetables or to stab someone in a combat, for example. So you still have technical affordance, but the actual ethical deliberation, what you do with the knife, whether you cut the vegetable or if you stab someone, happens at the end. With automated decision-making system, we both reverse this logic. So whatever ethical deliberation happens at all, it needs to happen upstreams, because downstreams, it's implementation and execution. And then we can also make a qualitative argument that we perhaps not just shift the, but we will constrain the space in relative terms. But that I won't take a stance on here and now. Moving on. Against this backdrop, a wide host of so-called governance mechanisms have been designed or proposed. And what do I mean with governance mechanisms? I mean tasks, protocols, procedures, tools, all designed to shape normative behaviors of individuals and organizations. So it's really means of social control. And these can vary from impact assessments and checklists to human in the loop protocol, where actually human operators are sitting and improving automated decisions. We can work with ethically aligned design. This is very popular in some strands of research, especially in human-computer interactions. And auditing of AI, what I'm studying specifically, is just one example of such a governance mechanism. So what all of these governance mechanisms have in common is that they are trying to bridge some kind of normative goal, like adherence to an ethics principle, for example, with the actual design and revealed behavior of AI systems. So this auditing of AI, how we can design feasible and effective auditing procedures to ensure such an alignment, if we want to use that term, that is the main focus of my PhD. Now, one thing I want to stress up front is that this need for auditing, it's actually coming from two directions at the same time. So on the one hand, we have regulators who are seeking new enforcement mechanisms. And we can think of this in terms of also social and political legitimacy, because although there are many different theories about what grounds legitimacy, if we look at internal legitimacy, one such component is, can we as a government actually address the problems people experience? So our constituency, what they feel is a problem, can we address this? So it's also partly a legitimacy problem. So, and here we see in the European AI Act, they're calling it differently. They're calling it conformity assessment and post-market monitoring, but in essence, in execution, it is an auditing procedure. Then we also have bottom-up pressures. And here we can think about it from the perspective of technology providers who want to manage technology risk. This can have to do with legal risk, it can have to do with financial risk, but it can also have to do with reputational risk, as we have seen in some companies who are, for example, having severe AI failures, that they both lose employees, but also attractiveness to customers. So with or without academic, shall we call it, proposal for auditing, we're seeing this ecosystem emerging through a confluence of these top-down and bottom-up pressure. One thing we have to be a bit cautious of is that the cause for auditing is in some way taking a very old idea and practice and applying it to a new area. So as we all know, auditings have long existed in, for example, employment safety, in workplace safety, in financial accounting, and also in social science studies. And many researchers have taken these procedures and applied them to auditing, such as, for example, for AI system and large language models. But with these metaphors, analogies, we need to be a bit careful, because it's not always that the features and properties of auditing procedures actually translates very well. And that is partly what I studied in my own research, to see what kind of lessons from auditing in other spaces can we actually transfer to AI systems. Here is perhaps the main point I want to make in the first half of the presentation before we go to large language models specifically. The term auditing of AI is used very different by different researchers and from different strands. And we can paint this map in very complex fashion, but I want to simplify it and say we can distinguish between narrow and broad approaches. Narrow approaches takes auditing to mean a relationship between input-output, so that, for example, researchers or auditors prompt the system for a wide range of input data, look at the output data and try to infer the workings of the systems. And this is quite common in computer science. It's quite common in social science. For example, in the social science audit studies, it's almost like a randomized control trial, if you so will. And this can be used to evaluate, for example, model properties, for example, for discriminatory or erroneous outputs. Now, there's also another tradition, if we call it a broad approach, and that is more where independent auditors come into an organization to review the adequacy of existing governance structures. So, for example, what is actual software development process? What are the quality management system in place? What are the incentives here for developers, decision makers, and so on? And while perhaps there is fewer academic papers right now on this kind of AI auditing, if we look at what is happening in industry and the tradition of auditing, this is a more deeply rooted practice in the organization that are offering auditing services. And what has happened over the last few years, when this ecosystem that I told you about, that it's growing from the top down and bottom up pressures, is that a lot of companies, both, for example, the big four that used to do financial accounting, but also a lot of startups, like perhaps you've heard about Oracle, that is Cathy O'Neill startups, but also many others, are starting to do AI audits. And when these companies are referring to their AI audits, they're actually talking about broad approaches. And these are by no means mutually exclusive. For example, we can take narrow approaches and apply them in individual steps of broader auditing approaches. But to boil it down, what both of these have in common is that whether you take a narrow or broad approach, auditing is a structured procedure, so it's not ad hoc. It's an independent procedure. So whether it's done by internal or external auditor, there should be operational independence from the people who are developing the software. And it's used to express an opinion or to verify claim about something. And this something can either be the AI system itself, but it can also be the company that is designing and disseminating the systems. So let's make this map even more fine granular. And perhaps if I were to use one slide to look at the landscape of AI audits, I would use this. And the first thing I want to show you is if we think what is actually being audited. There are three levels of abstractions here. We can either look at the functionality audit, and then we only ask, what is this system used for? Is that an ethical or legal task in and of itself? And for example, there have been fun papers about this in the literature. Whether, let's say, machine that slaughters retired people into pie that others eat, that is an illegal and unethical automated decision-making system in and of itself, whether it's distribute the people it kills in a fair and transparent manner. So functionality audits ask the purpose, what is this system for? Does it align with our laws, but also our normative expectations? The model audit zooms in on the technical system itself and basically asks the question, does it do what it says it does? So it verifies claim made about the model properties. But then there is a third one that is separate from both the function and the model, and that is actually the impact, because we might think that we have an ethically sound or legal task that we're trying to automate. The model can be verified insofar as it does what it's supposed to do, but when this system interacts in a nonlinear environment with users in an unforeseen way, it can still have both unintended, unethical, and illegal impact. So the impact audits disregards the system and only looks at the output. Now, for each of these three approaches, we can have different criteria that we audit against. So audits always requires a baseline against which we evaluate the system. And this can be technical specifications. Basically, what engineers and software developers are using, this can have to do with precision, robustness, accuracy. We can have legal requirements. And for example, in the US, there are some legal requirements on automated and AI decision making that comes from, for example, anti-discriminatory lawsuits, but also individual privacy. And then finally, there can be ethics principles that companies voluntarily subscribe to, as we have seen many different industry firms, whether we're talking tech firms like Microsoft and Google, but also more bread and butter mainstream industry have published ethics principles on their own. And the final here, shall we call it the dichotomies between internal and external audits. Now, one thing to stress here is that even if an internal audits are conducted within an organization, there is still, to some extent, an adversarial relationship whereby the auditor is actually requesting information from the management of the line productions, and they are not part of the same team, and they have different incentives, and they report to different stakeholders. So it's still an adversarial relationship. And at the same time, even if it's an external audit, external auditors are also still dependent to some extent of the actual and active collaboration of the organizations they audit. So what I want to say here is that although this distinction is often made, in practice is often less of a dichotomy and more of a spectrum that has to do with access level. So how much information can we access? Now, this is the last slide before we move on and talk about large language models specifically. And this has to do with where my research fits into previous work, but also what has been going on in the field. And the first thing to stress here is that research on AI auditing is extremely multidisciplinary. So we have contributions from computer science, from systems engineering, from law, but also from fields like political and moral philosophy and sociology. And broadly, these can be divided into 4 different aims. And now I'm talking here about the normative, if you so will, aims. The first are research that propose that AI systems should be audited. And this strand of research typically advance arguments, for example, legal reasoning or philosophical justifications why we should audit. And here we have both that regularity and transparency enable good governance. We have other claims such as the operational independence contributes to objectivity and professionalism in evaluation. And this strand of the research, so to say, spearheaded research on AI auditing already around soon 10 years back. Then there is a second strand where researchers develop tools and procedures to audit. So you're already one step down if you think in the level of abstraction. And here we have both more technology-oriented audits, for example, new tools, how to, shall we call, test or even visualize model properties. But also other researchers, especially from the organization study side, have outlined new procedures and more put up meta criteria for what do we need to look at in the system development process in order to provide meaningful assurance. The third are researchers who are taking tools and procedures available to study actual empirical phenomena. And that can either be the impact of AI system, but it can also be the characteristics and behavior of AI systems. And then finally, there is a strand of research that sort of on a meta level, study and critique auditing procedures to see how feasible are they, how effective are they, what can we say on the basis of this. And my own research follows the 2 categories. I first study the feasibility and effectiveness of existing auditing procedures so as to then inform and improve the design of available tools and methods. So I'm not here primarily to say that we should audit systems. I'm saying that is already happening, that is already being done, that is basically an empirical phenomenon. We can go out in industry and see AI systems are being audited. I'm also not taking audit studies and doing social science studies. That is a distinct field of research. So what I'm doing, I study and critique auditing methods, and I develop new tools and procedures to do so. Now, with that said, but wait, do we have any question at this stage, or shall we collect the question at the end? I can pause for a minute. Yes.
Earlier, you talked about there's limitation of applying lesson from financial accounting auditing or employee safety to AI. Can you give a few examples about where the transfer works, where the transfer doesn't work?
Yes, that's a good question. So let's start with, for example, financial accounting. One of the first things there I would say has to do with the stakeholders involved in the audit. Actually, when financial audit first came, the accountability mechanism was from the investors and the owners to the management. And that grew a certain ecosystem where the auditors was used, I mean, if we're talking very colloquial language, as a safeguard, checks and balance, almost to gather information and provide assurance for the investors. When we're talking the AI audits, the stakeholders are a bit different. That has more to do both with the democratic legitimacy, as I spoke about from governments, but also from the normative expectation from consumers and users. And that puts very different demands on what is expected of an auditor. The second is that financial audits, for example, if you take a very standardized method there, such as sampling documentation, you basically pick out a few transactions, you verify them for coherent consistency, legality, and then you approve. When you have, but the material you study is dead material so far. So once the transaction is approved, it stays the way it is. Whereas we're talking with systems that continue to learn, evolve over time, interact dynamically. So it's both difference in the stakeholders involved, but also the actual methods that are used to study. So that was just, one example, or two, if depending on how we slice and dice it. Okay, yes.
In the previous slide, would you mind clarifying the difference between 3 and 4 again, and like which disciplines tend to tackle?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's a good point. So leveraging audit methods to conduct empirical studies. This is primarily done by two sets of researchers. One, you have social scientists leveraging audit tools to study empirical social science phenomena. And that can be done almost like a random control trial. So for example, just like audit studies has been used to look for discrimination in, let's say, housing market in sociology, you can use the same kind of audit tools and methodologies to look for, I'm sorry, Varun is not here anymore, but for example, to audit ad delivery system for discrimination between genders on Facebook. That is just one example. And you also have computer scientists, especially within, let's say, the fact community, looking for fairness, accountability, and transparency in machine learning, also publishing a lot of papers on audit. And here, I think a famous study is the gender shade studies, also by Blomina and Gabriel. The latter has a bit more to do with science and technology and organization studies. That is primarily conceptual contributions, not empirical contributions. And they more look at the subversive effect of auditing itself. So for example, there is, I don't know, have you heard about the term ethics washing? That companies sometimes employ certain methods to look more ethical than they actually are, or even to delay necessary legislation. And both in science and technology studies and organization studies, there's a big and growing literature on how AI audits are being used to further such corporate malpractices. So that is how I would distinguish them. Yes.
I had a very like I'm not in this space question of especially early on talk about automated systems and AI, automated systems and AI. Where do you draw the line in terms of like policy making? Like you have drawn out these steps. How do those four differ for like control F, control R, AI for automated systems?
I'm glad you asked this question now, since soon we will also throw large language model into the box, right? So it's really broad scope. Personally, when I do my own writing, I avoid terms such as artificial intelligence completely. I think what we're talking about here, we're basically looking for different ways to automate tasks. Those tasks can sometimes be more manual, sometimes more cognitive. We can use different computational and logical techniques to automate these tasks. It can be logic-based expert systems, or it can be probabilistic and connectivist neural networks. So that is why I often talk about automated systems and automating tasks as opposed to AI systems. What I have noticed over the years is that if you write the paper, hold the talk, and you talk about AI system, it aligns a bit better with the discourse for policymakers and perhaps also especially in the industry. So that is why I'm using that terminology here. Otherwise, in my own dissertation writing, I stay clear on the term AI completely.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Now, let's look at large language models. We have roughly half of it left. This is my most recent paper, and it was published in collaboration with a few colleagues in Oxford. Just to mention briefly, it's an interdisciplinary team. Jonas has a background in law, Hannah in computer science, and Luciano is a philosopher. I'm a bit of a mix match, so I fit in there quite well. And we published and uploaded this preprint a few weeks back. So this is all very fresh. The article is still under review, so we very much welcome all feedback. The scope was really to look at, just as we said that the AI system in general have these both affordances and constraints. We can very much use that lens when we zoom in on large language models. So just to start with what we're talking about. We're talking about systems, again, with the core capability to produce a likely continuation of a text prompt. These are typically based on neural networks and are trained on vast amounts of data to learn the statistical relationship between words. And this can be used to automate a wide range of cognitive tasks, such as text summarization, search, language translation, just to give some examples. And I'm sure no one here in the room have missed the recent, for example, rise of ChatGPT. I should probably update this now from GPT-3 to GPT-4, but you know the examples. There are many others, also like Lambda, for example. Now, ethical considerations have been mapped in quite depth. There's, for example, a very good paper here by Weidinger et al. From also the team at DeepMind, and they list a bunch of ethical and social risk. I think it's over 20. But if we cluster them into the high-level risk areas, we can talk about bias and discrimination. So language models can propagate stereotypes that exist in society. This in turn can lead to allocational and representational harms. We also have information hazards, and because as these neural networks are trained on data, there are methods where adversarial attacks can actually extract and reconstruct sensitive data from the training sets. Misinformation hazards, this is a quite important one because a language model just looks at statistical relationship. It doesn't have an actual model of the world. So it can very easily answer incorrect or falsehood, whatever we were going to call them, untruth. Malicious use is if they are employed, for example, for unethical or illegal purposes, such as scamming, mass emails, or even impersonating someone in ways that are not allowed or that we don't want to happen. Human-computer interaction harm is a bit more different because that has to do with the relationship with humans and the system. And that is what I talk about more, the subversive effects, such as, for example, removing the ground for certain professions or experiences or way of life, but it also has to do with where the technological normativity takes over, so that we design spaces after how the system works and not how we humans want to live. And finally, if we look at automate and environmental harms, we also know that these systems take a lot of energy to train and process. And as I think also Crawford made quite clear in her book Atlas of AI, there is also a way wider range of ethical and social issues that comes into play when we talk about large language models. Now, against this backdrop, what is important here is that policymakers and companies are looking for new ways to evaluate and analyze these technologies. And this is again where the hypothesis have been put, we need to audit systems. And one thing I want to make clear here is that we are not the ones saying that AI and large language model system needs to be automated. For example, there was very recently, Sam Altman in an interview said that efforts like ours should be audited before we release system. Similarly, there are papers from policymakers, for example, in the European Union, that are considering classifying large language models as high-risk AI system that then would make them subject to audits. So again, the push towards audit of LLMs is already happening, both from industry and policymaker. And we are asking, what are the affordances and constraints of existing AI auditing procedure if we were to apply them to large language model? So what can we expect? What are the best case scenario we can say about this? And second, given these constraints, how can technology providers and policymakers design LLM auditing procedures in ways that are feasible and effective in practice? And how did we do this? First, we did the literature review on existing AI auditing procedures. Then we had expert interviews with software developers at labs and with policymakers, primarily in a European and UK context. And finally, the conceptual analysis, where we link the properties of the system with the properties of the auditing methodologies. And two quick caveats. One is this is work in progress, as I said. And the second is this is really tricky business because auditing, as you saw, is a complex field in of itself. And then with large language model, we add all the complexities that has to do with language. For example, what is an actual experiential harm, or what is, for example, in philosophy, there's a really big divide between realist and idealist, even when it comes to truth, concepts like truth in the first place. So we're trying to stay away from the philosophical interpretation and more look at pragmatic operationalizations. And that we can discuss more of in the question. Now, a lot of work is happening right now in terms of auditing large language model. For example, a lot of researchers have looked at tools, specific tools to audit and evaluate models of the different properties. So some of these are called benchmarks, but what you actually do is that you do this input-output probing that that we saw in the narrow field of audits. Technology providers have experimenting methods like red teaming, where they have an adversarial team who are probing their system to look for vulnerabilities. It's also a tool that is very traditionally used, for example, in worker safety audits and systems engineering. Industry bodies have put out framework for auditing generative and general AI systems, including most recently the NIST framework. And policymakers, as I mentioned, the European Union are incorporating the governance of large language model into the EU AI Act. And what our blueprint that we'll present here does, it does not seek to replace any of these initiatives. They are all needed as part of a multifaceted approach. We're showing how they can be connected into a structured and independent procedure that characterizes auditing in this space, and how that together will provide better assurance and more holistic governance of large language model than either of these strands can in isolation. But first, before showing you that three-layered approach, I want to stress that there are 4 properties of large language model that make them especially tricky to audit if we compare it to other AI systems that are being audited. The first is generativity. And here, sorry for the confusion in terms. Within large language model and other AI system, generativity is sometimes meant to mean generate some kind of output, generate a text or generate an image. But if we look at technology, innovation, design more broadly and historically, a generative technology is one that gives rise to downstream use cases and innovation. One example of that is, for example, the internet was called the generative technology insofar as it was a foundation on which other people could innovate and develop. And here, if we look at the large language model, they are highly adaptable to a wide stream of use cases. And most existing auditing methods have focused on audit AI system for a specific task in a specific industry. For example, there are very rigorous auditing methodologies to look at software used in hiring, for example, to screen resumes. That is something that we can audit because it's boxed in. But the generativity of large language model undermines such procedures. Second is emergence. With emergence here, we mean 2 things. The first is as the model is scaled, either in terms of properties, in number of parameters, layers in the model, we see that new capabilities emerges. So for example, a bigger model is more capable in terms of addressing a wide stream of cognitive tasks than a smaller one. This means that as a family, for example, of large language models evolves, we can't just have audit in one point in time. It needs to be a continuous auditing process as the system evolves and as new capabilities emerges. So that is the second point. The third is a lack of grounding. And I alluded to this earlier, and that is that LLM doesn't require a model of itself or the world. In fact, it hasn't any. And this means that existing audit procedures that audit the system against a predefined baseline, such as legal compliance, or for example, accuracy of your statements, will have a hard time audit large language models because they only look for internal cohesion and coordination. The fourth is lack of access. And basically we say if an auditor wants to audit a large language model, they need to have access to the model, the training data and other things. But many of these models are only accessible via an API. And not only that, some of the models aren't published at all. For example, we don't know all the models different labs have that they are not releasing. And this means that a lot of the auditing procedures that have hitherto been conducted by independent third parties, unless there is a legal mandate to get into the labs, are severely constrained. So these are some of the properties that undermine existing auditing procedures. Now, against this backdrop, our analysis, and this is a conceptual analysis we made, listed 6 key claims. And that would say, if we were to audit large language models, these are the minimum number of claims that need to be satisfied by an auditing procedure. These claims are more general than our own approach. These can be used by other researchers to design their own auditing strategies or by other companies. But we want to start with them to see also because they provide a justification for our own blueprint how to audit large language models. To start with, we say that auditing procedures that focus on compliance alone will not be able to provide meaningful assurance for LLM. And with here, we do the distinction between compliance and risk audits. And this is also a quite standard distinction in the auditing literature, whereby risk audit is the auditor works together with the technology provider to proactively identify and mitigate risk that then informs the next iteration of the design. So that is not just compliance, but also risk audit. Number two, because of both the high risks involved with large language models, but also because of what we know of how independence contributes to professionalism and objectivity, we want audits of LLMs to be external. Number three, and this is, I think, a key point. These broad and narrow approaches, which we can also call governance and technology audits, none of them will on their own be sufficient to identify and mitigate the harms caused by large language models. So the auditing procedure needs to combine elements of both. And here comes a key part. While we can take best practices in governance audit that we're doing in IT audit already and apply that to labs developing large language models, methodological innovations and modifications will be required on the technology audits part. That is what we spoke about on the previous slides with emergence and generativity, for example. And this is basically following from the first, that we need to introduce this layer of the model audit. So historically, we have the governance audit of technology providers. We have systems and product certification procedures before market launch. But because of this generativity, we need to introduce the third and middle layer of auditing large language model after their first training, but prior to fine-tuning for individual application and purposes and tasks. And the final one is that because large language models both display emergent properties, but also have the ability to learn over time, but to include an element of ex-post auditing. That means continuous monitoring over time. So not just prior to market release, but also monitoring of systems output over time. That was a lot. So I will simplify that by putting together what we call a three-layered approach. So what we propose in our paper that is called Auditing Large Language Model is that three types of audit activities should be conducted in parallel that inform each other. The first is a governance audit, the second is a model audit, and the third is an application audit. Now, these differ both in scope and methodology. Who is audited? Well, in the governance audit, it's a technology provider. In the model audit, it's a large language model. And in the application audit, it's a downstream application. What is a downstream application? It can, for example, be a medical chatbot that incorporates a large language model, which would need to be evaluated in this context against, for example, software as a medical device. But it could also be a search engine or a translation engine. And then that would be audited against the sector-specific norms and expectations that exist for that application. Now, they also differ in terms of observables. So the governance audit really looks at processes. So not systems, not impact, but processes, and specifically the processes in the labs that are developing large language models. And they assess the adequacy of quality management systems, of risk management systems, of data sourcing and model training. And now this might seem a lot. This might look like, okay, is it auditing everything? Is it a control state that should look at everything? But I want to de-dramatize this a bit by saying a lot of this is already happening. Almost every big technology company are conducting different levels of IT audit and system development audits. The key is just what criteria you look for. For example, historically, they have been focused on quality management issues. So how do we get the right specification and resource allocation? How do we know that we are spending the best time for our developers and managers? So all we're saying is that since these processes are in place, they can be updated and revised to also include observables that help us develop and design safe large language models downstreams. And here, if we look at the methods that governance audit use, it's basically a review of internal documents and it's interviews with management and software developers. So those are the methods that they're using. One thing I should say here before we go on to the other is that while external auditors should conduct audits at all three levels, it's by no means the case that it needs to be the same organization conducted audits at all three levels. In fact, it's highly unlikely because doing these different audits require different competences. As we will get to in the next stage, conducting model audits of large language model is very complex, time intensive, even for computer scientists and developers who work with this on a daily basis. So it should be external audits, but the kind of auditors and organizations will vary through the levels. If we move on to the model audit, here the really key point is to audit the large language model for characteristics, for example, like information security, like truthfulness, like robustness. And one of the things that should be said up front is all of these are concepts that are hard to define in and of itself. We will not have one metric that says this model is truthful or this model is robust. Instead, what auditors are often doing, they're using a plurality of metrics and see how the model performs across these different benchmarks. And they're also very careful to document how the model has been tested, verified, and audited. And here comes a key point. While they're using very standardized engineering and computer design tool, like formal verification, benchmarking, and adversarial methods, the key point is that they document the model limitations and user instructions so that during application audit, we can check and ensure whether these limitations have been accounted for in the design of downstream applications. So the model audit, as we will see in the next slide, will play a key role. Application audits are very similar to what we are more commonly known as product testing and certification procedures. You can think of how they, for example, FDA in the US test food and drug substances, just as an example. But basically in many sectors, or we also have software as a medical device, there is already sector-specific procedures for how to do this. Usually we look here at impact assessment. We look at the observed impact, such as bias and discrimination. We look for avenues for complaint management. How can we, if we have experience of harm conducted by system, make a claim against the technology provider? And it's impact-oriented method. So we monitor system output, conduct compliance check, and bias and discrimination audits. Now, all of these things, as I mentioned, they're already to some extent happening. But the key methodological innovation here is that all these three auditing procedures can be connected into one structured process insofar as output from one audit become input that audits at another level have to take into account. We can take many examples here, but let me highlight a few. Say, for example, we're conducting an application audit. One of the criteria that auditors here can look at is have the limitation of the model as documented during the model audit being accounted for in the design of the application. So for example, perhaps the technology provider of the large language model say, this is not intended for giving financial advice or for giving mental health recommendation. Well, to start with, if the application is giving mental health guidance or financial advice, we already have used the output from a model audit as an input in the application audit to evaluate the system. But importantly, the feedback also goes upstream. So during application audit, when we see what is the actual impact of an LLM has, we can look at the governance audit to say, the labs or technology providers are developing LLM. Do they have mechanisms for incorporating feedback, for example, from downstream harm or observed impact? So no blame. We know that you put out the system, but now we have seen that these are the effects that are happening to society. Do you have any mechanism of incorporating that into your design? And actually that in itself then becomes a point of checking the process of the technology provider during governance audits. So what we can see here, to start summarizing, because I want to leave 15 minutes for questions as well, what we're proposing is that audit should be conducted at 3 different levels: governance, model, and application. To some extent, that is already happening. What is not happening is that it's not conducted in a structured manner. It's very ad hoc. For example, some labs are doing red teaming, some labs are not doing red teaming. It's also not done independently. Some labs are doing this with their own staff. Some are hiring a team of researchers, but there's no like independent ecosystem to conduct this audit. And it's not happening interconnectedly. So all of these different activities are taking place in isolation, when a lot of the actual synergies that would help us identify and mitigate some of the harms from LLMs only happen when you connect these dots into a structured independent auditing process. My final slides will be talking about the limitations. So everything so far, so especially these 2 slides here, are aspirational. This is the blueprint. This is what we would like to see. Now, this is clearly not the case, and there are also good reasons for this. And while there are many limitations of our approach, I will highlight personally what I think are the three biggest, shall we call them, weaknesses of our proposal. The first is construct validity. It sounds very good to audit the large language model for robustness or truthfulness. In practice, there will always be a gap from what we think we mean with the system and the formal verification where we need to specify some kind of definition. And this has multiple reasons. One is that different definitions disagree or incompatible, but the other are just like our normative intuitions do not always converge in the first place. The second is the institutional framework that I spoke about. So even though these activities are taking place in isolation and ad hoc, an institutional ecosystem to conduct structured audit of LLM specifically, but of AI system generally, has yet to emerge. In the European Union, we are somewhat further, especially now with the AI Act demanding conformity assessment, but in the US, there is still no way of verifying claims that an LLM has been audited. And the final is the level of abstraction. Now, although we might be tempted to blame all problems on the technology, I think it's safe to say that not all problems can be addressed at the technology level. For example, some of the frustration we feel might be intrinsic in different desires that we want, but not all good thing comes together. So the key here is to not overstate what can be done either with audit or software development, but instead to identify the specific challenges during application audits that we can address during the system development phase. So to just say, our blueprint does by no means solve these challenges, but it has been designed and shaped with them in mind. Yeah, I think let's actually do question the last 15 minutes. Thank you.